Welcome to the second session of the IIP webinar series on promoting gender equality in education. Today, we're going to have the another great pleasure to welcome Karen Mundy, the Chief Technical Officer of the GPE. Now, last week, you remember that we had Aaron Benabot, who introduced the new 2016 gender review of the GEM report. And he actually introduced to us the great challenge that we have for all the governments to monitor the progress for the sustainable development goals. Now, just for those of you who do not know me, I am Miyoko Saito. I'm the gender focal point at the IIP, and I am the coordinator of this online course. As you know, that this webinar series has been organized in the framework of the IIP online course on monitoring and evaluating gender equality in education. So let me first introduce Karen. Karen Mundy is the Chief Technical Officer at the GPE. Now, she has been also, before joining GPE, she was the Associate Dean and the Professor at the Ontario Institute of
Study in Education.
Yes, Study in Education. WIS, yeah, that's right. And then so Karen's research studies focus mainly on the politics in the EFA programs, as well as the a lot of educational programs in the sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the role of the civil society organizations for the educational change. I think I got everything right. Now, so today, Karen is going to introduce two documents. Let me just show you those two documents. The first one is GPE 2020. The other one is the Gender Equality Policy and Strategy 2016 and 2020. So I'm going to now switch to Karen. All right. So let me. Okay, the floor is yours, Karen, please.
Good. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm very delighted to be here following in the footsteps of Aaron to talk a little bit about the approach taken by the Global Partnership for Education, which is a partnership around the issues of gender equality in education. And as you all learned from Aaron last week, we know that only about 31% of low-income countries and 52% of lower middle-income countries have achieved gender parity in primary education, and the rates of gender parity are even lower at the lower secondary level. Only 9% of low-income countries have received gender parity. The Global Partnership for Education takes those statistics very seriously, and part of our work over the last year has been to develop a gender equality strategy that focuses both on improving our organizational capacity to address gender equality, but also earmarks and identifies gender equality as one of the main strategic objectives for the partnership. I want to then turn now to the PowerPoint that we're going to present. And what I'm going to do is walk you through our strategic plan, which was adopted by our board in December of 2015 for the period from January 2016 through to the end of 2020. I want to talk to you a little bit about our theory of change and the way that gender equality itself figures across the strategic plan. And then I'm going to talk in more particularity about our gender equality strategy, which was developed by a committee of our board in cooperation or with strong inputs from provided by Ongai, who also helped us to sort of channel the expertise of a much wider network on gender equality. So as I said, the urgency is clear. You learned from Erin about some of the statistics and the drivers behind gender gaps. I wanted to just emphasize that among the drivers is the driver of conflict and fragility. And so the statistics Erin presented to you are even more dire in countries affected by conflict. And our partnership over the last 5 years has become increasingly focused on supporting educational change and development in fragile and conflict-affected countries. About 50% of our overall financing goes to countries affected by conflict and fragility. And so I think one of the hallmarks of our work in gender equality is going to have to be finding differentiated approaches to gender equality in countries where there are large populations of displaced large populations of displaced people or communities that are excluded from the core education system. So let me tell you a bit about the partnership, GPE itself. We are a multi-stakeholder partnership and a funding platform. We have three sort of purposes. The first is to expand inclusive and equitable quality learning. The second, to strengthen education systems. And the third is really this focus on acting as a broker and trying to promote coordination around a government-led sector plan, making sure that all actors sit around a common policy table. So this diagram or this slide is I hope it's self-explanatory, but I'm going to explain it in any case. That really just if you look at the middle, our country level model, the operational platform we have at the country level, focuses on three pieces. The first piece is GPE supports better sector planning. We do this by being the largest funder of sector planning and sector analyses in low income and lower middle income countries. And we provide governments grants of up to $500,000 to conduct sector analyses and conduct sector plans. And we also have worked with partners, including IIEP, to establish some criteria for what a good sector plan and a sector analysis look like. And we help countries to improve their sector plans. So we have a quality assurance process through which countries go to vet and improve their sector plans through an appraisal process. The second pillar in our country level theory of change is improving policy dialogue through mutual accountability. GPE fosters the creation of national policy dialogue tables, otherwise known in GPE lingo as local education groups. These are government-led groups that bring together donors to the education sector, international donors, as well as national stakeholders, prominently civil society organizations and teachers' organizations. And the goal of these dialogue tables or legs is to help government both to develop the very best plans at the subsectoral and sectoral levels and policies, and to work with the government to ensure that those plans are implemented. They play a critical role in mutual accountability through the joint sector review process, which is a process typically annually where countries bring stakeholders together to review progress in education against the sector plans. Thirdly, and of course this is where most of the money that GPE as a fund is channeled, we provide results-focused financing. Our financing is, first of all, allocated based on needs. So countries with the largest numbers of out-of-school children, countries with the lowest GDP per capita, receive the bulk of the allocation from that fund. But that allocation is really just a notional allocation. Countries then have to prepare a proposal to the GPE, and that proposal includes criteria that countries must meet in order to be eligible for the funding. They must have a strong sector plan. It has to be credible and it has to be costed. They must have a strategy either already in place to collect sufficient data to be able to monitor their systems, or they must have a strategy in place to build that system. And they must provide a level of domestic financing that is sufficient to catalyze the kinds of changes proposed in their sector plan. In particular, GPE asks governments to be clearly moving towards a spend of 20% of their overall domestic budget on education. And countries that do not achieve that 20% mark are not their applications are not approved, generally speaking. So they must be moving in the right direction. Thirdly, just to say one more thing about our results-focused financing, we offer financing in a 70-30 split. So the 70% of your allocation you get because you've met those criteria. You've got a good plan, you've got a data strategy, and you've got domestic financing. And the grant that you've, the proposal you have for using GPE money backs the plan sufficiently. But 30% of our money is delivered as results-based financing. So each country, when it steps forward to access its allocation, must select 3 targets, one in the area of equity, one in the area of learning, and one in the area of efficiency. Those targets are, we don't prescribe them. They must be set at the country level with the local education group, so they are nationally owned. But we pay 30% of the allocation upon achievement of those targets. So that is a results-based financing mechanism, but the entire 70% plus 30% is results-focused, as you've already heard. So funding, just to summarize, funding is focused on poorest countries with highest rates of out-of-school children. It is about 50% of a total annual spend of about $500 million goes to fragile and conflict-affected countries, and the focus of that spending is on quality, equity, and efficiency. I've talked a little bit already then about our unique operating model, which is organized around country ownership, promotes alignment behind one plan and its implementation, leverages mutual accountability through the local education group and the joint sector review, and also increasingly leverages exchange of good practice and knowledge across countries within the partnership. And a very powerful asset of a partnership like ours with 65 developing country partners is in fact the governments and their willingness to discuss major challenges and learn from one another. And that's an area that GPE is increasingly making investments in. I've said already about our results-based funding model, so I won't repeat this slide. One thing I would just point out is that it is actually common for countries to select a gender-related performance target under the 30%. It doesn't happen all the time, but and often the targets being selected are, I guess you could call them output-based. So it might be increasing the number of female teachers, for example, or the number of female headmasters or headmistresses. But often in the equity category, gender is one of the targets. Our new strategy, I'm going to turn to that now, adopts the vision of the SDG 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning. All the members of our partnership were very insistent that our vision had to align with the SDGs. And our mission is focused on mobilizing global and national efforts to contribute to the achievement of equitable quality education and learning through inclusive partnership. And we put a lot of emphasis on the notion of inclusive, that is multi-stakeholder, not driven by government alone, not driven by civil society alone, not driven by donors, but actually a strong, inclusive partnership at both the country and the global level. And then this focus on really efficient and effective systems and stronger. In our plan, we call it more and better financing. We want more money, but we want money better spent. I'm not going to go through all the principles of the GPE, just highlight that this was the first time in GPE's history that the partnership adopted human rights as a fundamental principle for the partnership. And as you can see, Principle 3, gender equality, was adopted as a central principle of the partnership as part of our strategic planning process. Strategic goals of the GPE start at the impact level, which is more and equitable, improved and equitable learning outcomes, The second strategic goal for our partnership is increased equity, gender equality, and inclusion. And I think there's an interesting story to be told about how the word gender equality emerged in that target. Originally, it said increased equity and inclusion, when we thought that gender equality was adequately captured under equity. And a large constituency of our board said, no, it's not. You need to put that front and center in your strategic plan, and there it is. And then effective and efficient education systems. Now, these could sound like hot air or sound similar to what other organizations do. And I want to just distinguish for everyone the fact that in our partnership and as part of our strategic plan, each goal is linked to a set of indicators that we expect to be held accountable for. And I'll talk a little bit about those subsequently, but I want to be very clear that this is not hot air for us. These are actually goals that have indicators and results attached to them. Our country level objectives are to strengthen sector planning, to support this mutual accountability and policy dialogue inclusion that I discussed earlier, and to ensure efficient and effective delivery of GPE support. And again, these are not just hot air. Against each of these indicators, we now have methodologies and approaches for measuring our progress. We are measuring the quality of sector plans and their credibility. We are measuring the quality of the joint sector review process and trying to find ways of supporting and improving the joint sector review process so that the goal of mutual accountability and transparency are met. And of course, ensuring efficient and effective delivery of GP support, that is making sure our grants are effective and efficient, also is linked to core indicators in our theory of change and results framework. We have global level strategic objectives, and the first of these is more and better financing. And by more and better financing, we mean, first of all, of course, an international community that more sufficiently focuses its financing on countries where the needs are greatest. And you'll know from the recent Financing Commission paper that, in fact, by and large, aid has shifted more and more towards middle-income countries and away from low-income countries. And GPE has a special mandate to ensure financing for low-income countries and countries affected by fragility and conflict. And we also have a special mandate, we think, around domestic financing. That's why our funding model attempts to incentivize improvements in domestic financing. So when we say more and better financing, we mean both more and more international and more domestic. And then our last strategic objective is to actually build a stronger partnership. And as I mentioned, an enormous asset for a partnership like GPE is the fact that it brings together at the global level civil society actors, teachers organizations, the private sector, sovereign donors, multilateral donors, and 65 developing country partners. And we want to use that partnership as a platform to ensure that key policy challenges, including the challenges related to gender equality, are addressed effectively. And learning and lessons from effective policy solutions are spread and disseminated across and exchanged across the partnership. So I'm going to turn to what GPE does do already on gender equality, and it's quite a lot, actually. We have recently been able to code all of the country grants, the large grants, those allocations, to see what kinds of activities are our grants investing in, what kinds of supports are we offering governments to promote gender equality. And they're diverse. Many GPE grants focus on school construction in areas where children are not reached, and often the children not reached include a large proportion of girls. We have many grants that focus on the recruitment of female teachers, that focus on gender responsiveness in teacher training, that encourage women to take on administrative leadership, both within schools at district level and at the federal level or the central levels. Many of our grants have health, nutrition, components, including separate latrines or sanitary kits for girls. Many of our programs offer uniforms and school kits that are often highly beneficial for girls, bringing them into the school or ensuring that they are retained. And interestingly, I think about 6, Meg, or 8 programs have cash transfers or scholarships specific to girls, and some of those have been quite innovative, and we're pretty proud that those cash transfer programs have been able to ensure, especially in the transition from primary to lower secondary, that girls and boys, that gender equality is achieved. We have also got in our grants investments in what you might call community mobilization, so awareness raising campaigns, community discussion groups, social mobilization activities of other kinds, and many of them include the development of research, of better analytics, better evidence for about what girls need. There we go. I want to say a little more, though, because this is what I've just described is what's actually being funded under our central grant, our education plan program implementation grant. In addition to that, we have a few transversal activities that try to lock together knowledge, evidence about good practice across the partnership. For the last 3 or even 4 years, 3 years, we have been working with UNGAI to develop global guidance on what makes a responsive sector, gender responsive sector planning process and sector plan itself, and that guidance will be published this fall. We have supported a number of global public goods, the development of global and regional activities, including the out-of-school initiative, which has a prominent focus on out-of-school girls. And among the activities within the out-of-school GRA program has been the development of a number of metrics to track the intersect between various forms of disadvantage that girls face, both economic, that drive girls inequality, including early marriage. And we have also funded a program that really is just taking off. You'll have seen, if you are on UNGAI's listserv, that they published it yesterday, a program on school-related gender violence. And the first sort of survey of the evidence about school-related gender violence was published with GPE financing yesterday by UNGAI. Let me say just a couple of words about our results. So across GPE partner countries, we're going to focus now on the 61 countries that were members as of last year. We're now at 65, but for those 61, 9.3 million girls are now in school. More girls are now in school across our countries. More equal numbers of girls and boys are completing primary and lower secondary schools across our partnership. And there have been, in particular, noticeable advances in gender equality in countries affected by fragility and crisis. I said that all of our strategic goals are linked to a results framework, and I'm not going into a great deal of detail about the whole results framework, but I want to just emphasize that among the core indicators for our partnership, the indicators that the 65 developing country partners, our donors, our secretariat, and others are expecting to be held accountable for are several that focus on gender equality. In the first instance, most of the impact level indicators are disaggregated by gender. And so at the impact and outcome level, we have improvement in learning outcomes, which we are tracking using a trend-based indicator, and as far as possible, disaggregating by male and female. We have an indicator related to completion of primary and lower secondary education, again, disaggregated by male and female. We have a endorsed sector plans meeting quality standards, which includes a component related to sufficient attention to equity, gender equality, and inclusion. We have an indicator related to the quality of joint sector reviews, and we also have an indicator linked to the identification of targets in the funding model. And again, we're tracking where countries choose gender equality targets or other targets that are likely to improve gender equality. Our gender equality policy has a really interesting history, because what happened was that the government of Canada said, you know, we go about to different organizations and we do a gender equality institutional assessment. We have a program that does this. Would you like us to do that for GPE? The Canadians came in and they benchmarked us and they gave us a series of recommendations. And one of those recommendations was to adopt a new gender equality policy and strategy. And a board committee then worked on this, and it was, as I said, approved in June of 2016. This gender equality policy and strategy has three parts to it. There is a gender equality policy. There is a strategy of how to implement that policy from 16 to 20. And then there's an action plan for fiscal year 2017, which specifically earmarks resources for the Secretariat to deliver some of the components of the strategy and policy. Like any good strategy and policy, it has its own distinct theory of change. And this is aligned to GPE 2020's goals. So the first aim of the policy is to increase gender equality and access, participation, and learning for all girls and boys, linking to our impact level goals 1 and 2. The second is to improve gender equality in education systems. The third is to strengthen gender equality in education sector policy and planning processes. And the fourth, to ensure the robust execution of this commitment to gender equality across the partnership. What do we want to do? Well, first of all, we want to mainstream, we want to walk on two legs, both mainstreaming gender equality within core country level processes like the joint sector review, the sector planning policy cycle. But we also want to see targeted approaches, including within our grants. We want to pay attention to the multiple inequalities that converge to create disadvantage and tackle those in a holistic fashion. We want to ensure a differentiated approach so that we're responsive to varying country contexts. We want to improve and strengthen evidence and country level data that allows us to really track those multiple disadvantages that lead to serious disadvantage gender and around gender. We want to track the allocation of sufficient resources by governments domestically and by the international community. And we want to ensure that GPE and all of its arms, so its board, its secretariat, its committees, have the appropriate competencies and capacities to make sure that gender equality is mainstreamed in all our work. So I will just tell you a summary here, put up a slide. I don't want to go into great detail, but these are the summary output areas, the areas where in our theory of change we want to see outputs. And I'll just highlight that this focus on gender responsive analysis and planning and on coordinating across sectors. So to ensuring that there is a cross-sectoral lock-in that promotes gender equality. We know very well that stronger learning outcomes requires healthy children, and health across the lifespan requires more educated populations. And in particular, that educating girls acts as a protective intervention across the girl's entire lifespan. We have 5 key interventions in our action plan, which is what we're going to do in fiscal 2017, which is to focus on mainstreaming gender equality more fully into the work of the partnership. This really is focused on making sure that our gender equality policy does not get siloed, but that it actually touches on all aspects of our strategic plan and its rollout. Then we will be working on assessing the capacity, the gender equality capacities of the Secretariat Board and committees. And I'll tell you a funny story about that, which is that we were working with one particular committee on our gender strategy, and suddenly we looked around the room and realized that there wasn't a single woman on the committee. So it already has been quite instructive to us about about the kind, not to say that men might not have good knowledge of gender equality, but a basic principle of balance and parity on committees was highlighted through that experience. And actually, you know, funny enough was that nobody in the room had noticed it, not me and not any of the men. So it came up kind of fortuitously. We will be working with UNGAI. Our main partner in the gender responsive education sector plans to date has been UNGAI. We'll be working with them to produce guidance, which I believe is on track to be published and presented by the end of by the end of this calendar year. I've read a recent draft of it, and it is a truly wonderful product. But I think the next step for that product is really to translate it into something that's more simple and usable, sort of checklist type product that can be used more easily at the country level by national actors, by the local education group. I feel that few of our partners at the country level are going to read a very long guidance document unless they're gender specialists. And here the notion is mainstreaming. We need tools that the average planner can quickly use to just guide and ensure that gender equality is, again, walking on two legs in the sector plan and in its implementation, that it's mainstreamed across the plan, but also that there are targeted initiatives that make sense. We are very keen to explore the potential of the expansion of cross-sectoral interventions. Our board chair and CEO have mandated the Secretariat to begin to explore this, working with some partners in the health sector, prominently the Global Fund for HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. We will be conducting an initial fact-finding mission with them later this year. But the intention here really is to try to think how we can better catalyze change in gender equality by working across the health, the education, and the social protection sectors. And we are working to develop and to share gender equality knowledge products, including we are planning to create a kind of short annual brief on the status of gender equality across countries within the GPE partnership. We were able at the last board meeting in June to convene the ministers and other officials from ministries of education at a luncheon hosted by our board chair to discuss gender equality. There was a really strong uptake from them on this issue and a great keenness to work more effectively on gender equality across the partnership. And part of the way we want to do that is by exchanging good practice and also asking countries themselves to work together to puzzle out what kinds of policy solutions work best in different contexts. I'm going to stop there and just refer you to our GPE 2020, our strategy. Refer you to our gender equality policy and strategy, which, as I said, has those three components. We now have a great little at a glance summary of the policy, as well as the full policy available online. And I'll also refer you to our gender equality policy brief, which reviews some of the data I gave you on the kinds of components being funded in our grants and the various global and regional, the public goods pieces that we've been funding and that we hope to fund through our new knowledge and good practice exchange initiatives. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Karen. Now, you actually illustrated the very, very unique logic behind the GPE funding mechanism. And I think it's very, very encouraging for all the governments as well as the development partners. Now, I think I'm going to start with some of the questions that we have already received. Even before you started the presentation, we have received some questions.
Okay, good.
Okay, so the first one is like, oh yeah, there is no free lunch, right? That means that the country will have to show the credible, some kind of a, because 70% come from the fact that there is a credible plan document, and then 30% comes from something that is related to the performance they were able to achieve. So the question is, what do you mean by credible? You know, credible. What's the definition of credible? And then if because and another thing is that availability, availability of the recent education sector analysis, and that means that if they don't even have that data available, they cannot even start anything. And then 30% comes from the progress. You know, they have to demonstrate the progress. But then what happens if the progress is hampered due to external factors? So can you answer to that question first? Well, these three questions.
So okay, I unfortunately, I only heard about half of what you said. So let me answer the half that you did say, and then you can ask me to amplify based on what I didn't hear of your question. I think the first part of the question was, well, how do we know a plan is credible? GPE has worked with the IAP, in fact, to develop a set of tools or guidelines about the credibility of sector plans. What makes a good quality sector plan. These guidelines were developed in consultation then with members across the partnership. They were vetted by both external experts and our developing country partners. And so they're a broadly owned set of criteria around what makes a credible sector plan. And of course, we at GPE are not we're not a compliance-based organization. So in other words, we're not basically saying to governments, it has to be a perfect plan. But what we do want to know is that the plans, that the governments understand what credibility looks like and understands where there are gaps and are ready to fill in those gaps. And countries' capacities to plan, of course, vary a lot. We know very well at GPE that sometimes the best plans are actually done by external consultants, but that doesn't make them the most credible plans because the capacity to implement them is not there. So we try in our weighting and our monitoring of credibility to include criteria linked to the inclusiveness of the policy dialogue process that led to the plan itself, that link to government ownership, and also that highlight the need for plans. I always say sector plans often look like Christmas trees, many, many ornaments, but actually the tree underneath is pretty spindly. And we have criteria that are linked to the government translating the sector plan into an action plan that's costed. And I think that's very important because right away you know that the number of ornaments shrinks once you get to costing everything. And it's that action plan that is often critical to the quality of the implementation. So that's how we have approached the credibility. In a very partnership-focused way, building up a set of guidelines or criteria that express a common belief across our partnership about what credibility looks like, and then, of course, having an accountability mechanism through our results framework, our methodology for measuring whether those criteria are being met on an ongoing basis. And of course, we will use the data from the results framework on the quality of sector plans to then inform additional supports to countries to improve the planning process in the next cycle. So a very iterative, learning-based approach to this monitoring and the setting of these criteria.
That's great. That's a little bit of a publicity for the IIEP's work as well. Now, another question, also coming from one of the participants who are taking our course. Ensuring gender equality in education requires strengthening competencies of key education personnel and may also include changing attitude, values, norms, and expectations. This is not always an easy process, and financial resources only may not be sufficient. Which implications would this have for the technical assistance components of GPE's program? Which capacity development trajectories do you foresee with GPE's partners? Got the question?
Well, so really this is a question about how will GPE do the capacity development needed to achieve the objectives set out in its in the partnership-wide gender equality strategy. I think first of all, I was asked this at the UN General Assembly, a meeting there, a side meeting there, and they said, well, how are we really doing on gender equality in education? And I said, we're talking a really good talk, but at the country level, we're not really walking that talk. And of course, so much depends on anchoring capacities within ministries of education and in that broader stakeholder group, so that those groups both come to the table with strong evidence-based ideas about policy solutions, and also that there's that mutual accountability piece in place, which requires capacity for stakeholders outside government as well as for government itself. At the moment, our approach, which has been quite modest, we don't have a great deal of resources to put into this. What we've done so far is modest in that we're trying to focus in the first instance on the planning cycle itself and improving the capacity of ministries of education to do gender responsive planning as part of that broader policy cycle. I must say that I would observe anecdotally that in ministries of education, what you often have is a gender specialist sitting in one corner of the ministry, and then the planners and the head of finance sitting in another corner of the ministry, and they don't speak the same language. Their lingo is absolutely different. So what we would like to see is the planners being able to effectively use our guidelines in simplified form to benchmark the quality of gender responsiveness in their plans. And we'd like to make sure that the gender specialists have a little bit more understanding of the planning process so that they know how to drive evidence or support the policy dialogue around the plan so that gender equality is achieved. So we really see the audience as those two parties within the ministry, those that hold the power in the planning process, and then those that may have strong understanding of gender equality issues, but actually don't know much about planning. So how do we drive this together? And then in all of our work, when we convene at the country level and internationally, we'll always be bringing teachers' organizations and civil society organizations along with us, because we think their role in disseminating, mobilizing, and social accountability is so important to the achievement of the outcomes or the goals in the sector plans related to gender equality.
All right. Now, is GPE also working on gender within the secretariat itself? Do you have any examples of how senior management or the secretariat itself is embracing gender equality as an organization, not just with partners? And how are you going about that?
I mean, this is a really interesting piece, and it was one of the pieces that this gender institutional analysis that the Canadians did for us helped to bring forward. Well, first of all, I mean, GPE actually is staffed, the staff ratio, the gender parity is not very good, but it's actually very, very good if you think of it from how many women to how many men. So we have more women than men at all levels of the organization, including in the senior leadership team. But that doesn't mean that the topic of conversation in the leadership team is focused on gender parity as much as it should be. And so one of the issues that came up as part of our institutional analysis is really the need to have a kind of performance or results-focused conversation about gender equality on a regular basis in the senior management. Of course, I already mentioned that a lot of the time the Secretariat spends is working with our board to develop and to quality assure, develop and approve grant allocations. Again, that signals to me a need to make sure that gender equality is one of the topics of conversation when that the Secretary is able to bring that conversation into the committee work, especially our country grants and performance committee, and to the work of our strategy and policy committee. So we're working actually hard. I mean, we will do this initial who actually has depth knowledge about gender equality across the Secretariat? Where are there assets that could be drawn more effectively into programmatic activities. And then we'll be also looking then at what additional capacity is needed within the Secretariat and also within the board and its committees.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a lot of questions that were just coming in, so I'm going to, yes, I'm going to probably have to cut some of them, but then let me just concentrate on several of the questions that are around the definition of gender equality. Now, they must come from our participants because they have been studying a lot about the difference between the equality, difference between disparity and inequality, and then what's the meaning of the equality. It's not, okay, so here it is. It seems like you have used more gender disparity than gender inequality. Why? How would you distinguish them? How are gender measures addressing the quality of education, or will that be a focus in the future measure? Can you share an example of a country education sector plan which has nicely integrated a focus on achieving gender equality? How do you provide country level funding for recruitment of female teachers? The teaching profession is largely female already, and feminization may be needed at the level of school education leaders rather than just the teachers. So can you answer to
Well, now you're frozen again. Is there? Yeah. Again, some of your questions were broken, so I'll just try to address a few of them. You asked about our gender equality measures, and as I said, some of our gender equality measures are at the aggregate impact level and some at the process level. I think the question you had was really around gender equality in sector planning. And I would just refer you to a stock taking exercise that we will be publishing by the end of this year, I believe. And it doesn't bring us right up to date, but it actually brought us up to, I think, the end of 2015, and it reviewed the quality or the focus on gender equality in education sector plans across the partnership. So I'll refer you to that, and I think it's very much a story that could be told either glass half empty or glass half full. I would just say that we observed considerable challenges, and then we would like to use that as an opportunity to heighten awareness across the partnership about the need for both mainstreaming and targeted approaches to gender equality in sector planning. You asked about an example of a sector plan where gender equality is adequately addressed. I think I'd probably take Nepal as an example. It has a very strong focus on equity and inclusion more generally, very explicit targets under the results-based financing model linked to gender. And you can also see in the sector plan overall a commitment to disaggregation of data around gender and other forms of disadvantage. So I would just take that, but I think there are other very positive examples. I just took that as one that came top of mind. You know, you can look at other countries, I might say Malawi, where the initial gender responsive planning initiative was first piloted and experimented with. There, you know, I'm not going to say that the sector plan at the end was perhaps as I hate to make those kind of comparisons. I want to say that the growth from where the country began and where the country ended in the sector planning process was kind of impressive, and including the sort of mobilization of even down to the district level of a conversation about gender equality that would not have happened without the support for gender responsive planning. And I think in planning, it's really important that the planning process is not just about the planner sitting in primarily his office and modeling out different policy solutions, but actually having the opportunity to listen to communities and the kinds of policy solutions they think will work in their communities. And it's more important on gender equality than perhaps any other area because of, as one of your participants said, that the underlying attitudes, values, norms, and expectations that drive gender equality very much have they can't be addressed through compliance mechanisms. They have to be addressed by communities owning the solutions. it's very true that the recruitment of female teachers when systems are highly feminized already might not seem effective, but actually across GPE partners and especially low-income countries, the feminization of the teaching force at secondary level hasn't proceeded at the same pace that it has in middle-income and high-income countries. Will typically find, for example, very few female teachers in the STEM disciplines. And there is still a need, in particular, in rural areas or peri-urban areas for gender parity in the teaching workforce to be achieved. So the driver here really is that educated women often don't want to work in remote areas without access to basic services. They tend to cluster in urban areas, so you'll get high levels of feminization in some parts of the country and lower levels actually in the parts of the country where girls, in fact, their achievement, their access and retention is lowest. So there's some efforts to tackle that challenge in terms of gender parity, which at the aggregate might look like there's gender parity in the workforce, but actually by region or specific geographies is not there. Of course, the challenge of female leadership, that is getting gender parity in the headmasters, in the district level education office, in the ministry is an important feature. And of course, we see in some of our the grants that countries apply for a specific interventions linked to gender equality, improving the number of female district level and school level administrators. So, and we think that's important.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. The next question. The participants are very interested in hearing more about strategies and the best practices for teacher training on a gender responsive classroom that you might be promoting in your grant. Go ahead.
So I'm sorry, you're breaking up, so I didn't hear your question at all, but I'm just going to turn because we got a Skype-based question. It said, best practices for teacher training on gender responsive classroom practices might be promoted in your grants. In fact, there are grants where the countries have asked to have a teacher training or gender responsive teacher training included among the activities. We see that in almost every GPE grant, there is a teacher development or teacher training, whether pre-service or in-service component. And I couldn't agree more that after all, the rubber hits the road in the relationship between the teacher and the student. And so being gender responsive within the classroom is very, very important. And it's something that we would value. Now, remembering though that GPE doesn't then prescribe, it doesn't say every country has to do X or every country has to do Y. Instead, what GPE does is say, this is what a good plan looks like. This is a credible use of GPE money. And then it promotes the policy dialogue around what kinds of solutions are needed for which type of challenges. Without prescribing, we want to make sure that countries have at their fingertips the data, the evidence about what works best, so that they select themselves from a menu of best practices. So our job is a little bit different. We don't tell people how to spend our money, but we try to improve the availability of knowledge and evidence about what works at the country level, and also the peer in the policy cycle. So learning from your peer often is much better. And we know that from classrooms, that learning from your peer, learning with your peer, having your peer hold you to account is often much more effective than having an external agent drive through compliance delivery of specific components. So that's how we work. We have a different theory of change perhaps than others.
All right, next question. Which is probably going to be the last question, is that right? Yeah, okay. How would you define external and internal factors influencing the implementation of a gender transformative intervention in the education sector? Would you say GPE is an external or internal stakeholder?
Well, that's a great question. And you know, in the literature on international and international versus national theories of change, there's a small literature around something called the boomerang effect. The boomerang effect is where, at the global level or the transnational level, there is the creation of a set of norms and expectations that's sort of held above the national level. It becomes a resource and an asset for country level stakeholders. But at the national level, the countries, the stakeholders themselves own the policy process, but they can draw down on those international assets. To give you an example, if there's a strong international movement that says that early marriage is not acceptable, national advocates and civil society and governments can draw down on that to press their own governments, their own leaders to make those changes. That's the boomerang. And GPE operates very much like we are a global partnership, and we promote a national policy dialogue table that is a national partnership. So we operate at both spaces, at both levels, and increasingly we try to operate at a regional level. That is to say, we want to see countries within regions discussing policy problems with one another and seeking solutions together. So we have a complex theory of change, but I think actually a very powerful one that can be well understood if you think of that boomerang approach, the idea that policy changes, for example, a good change in a single country can animate at the global level a conversation about what works, and vice versa. A set of good practices that are recognized and set out as standards of good practice at the global level can animate a national policy dialogue.
Okay, great. So we understand that we have to leave very soon. So we're going to thank again for this wonderful opportunity to get to know how GPE funding is helping the countries in order to promote the gender equality in education. So next week, we're going to have another webinar, which is organized by IIP. We're going to have Nora Files, the head of UNGAI, who is going to present the UNGAI GPE guidance on gender responsive education sector plan. So please stay tuned. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.